Welcome to this month's IWM monthly lecture. I'm Ayşe Çağlar. I'm a permanent fellow here and also a professor at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, University of Vienna. We are very pleased and honored to have Katharyne Mitchell with us for the IWM monthly lecture. Katharyne Mitchell is a distinguished professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And by training, she's a geographer, and she was the chair of the Department of Geography at the University of Washington, Seattle, and she had held some different kind of administrative but also non-administrative positions in various places. She received several awards, including from Guggenheim, Fulbright, MacArthur, and Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, Stiftung. And she was a visiting professor and a fellow at various universities and institutes, including the University of Oxford and National University of Singapore and Max Planck Institute in Göttingen. She's the author, co-author, and co-editor of several books. To name some of the titles, I'm not going to bore you with all the titles. I'm sure that you rather would like to hear the talk than me reading the titles. The Routledge International Handbook of Critical Philanthropy and Humanitarianism, which I find it very interesting that with the other geography books that where you moved, but also on education now you work. Handbook on Critical Geography of Migration, Making Workers, Radical Geographies of Education, and Crossing the Neoliberal Line, Pacific Rim Migration and the Metropolis. Actually, this is through that book that Katharyne's made a big name, actually. And Life's Work, Geographies of Social Reproduction, and the Companion Guide to Political Geography. So from those titles, you see that her work covered migration, transnationalism, and urban restructuring, especially the spatial dynamics of transnational migration and citizenship. And her more recent work was on the shifting meanings and practices of sanctuary, which was again a very important topic to deal with the kind of the changing meanings of it. And her current work examines the spatial history using a conjunctural framework, and actually this is where we come to the title of the Katharyne Mitchell's talk. So I will not try to tell you what she does. She should tell you what she's working on and then how she approaches. So thank you very much being with us and for this lecture. The floor is yours, Katharyne.
My pleasure. Thank you. Okay, how's the sound? Good so far? Okay. So first of all, I'd like to give thanks to Ayşe for the warm introduction and for moderating this event, and also to the IWM for hosting me. It's already been a wonderful month, and I have a whole another month left. I'm so excited about that. The great staff here for making my time comfortable, and to the audience for coming tonight. Thank you all. So I'm going to begin my talk with 4 examples of monumental architecture in capital cities in 4 very different societies and 2 time periods. In the present, we can see architectural renderings here for Trump's Golden Arch to be located in Washington, D.C., and the Royal Riding Hall from Orbán's National Hauszmann program in Budapest, a major renovation project of earlier imperial buildings. In the mid-19th century, we can see Mussolini's Palazzo della Civiltà Italiana in Rome from 1942, and Hitler's planned dome for Germania, one of many buildings designed by Albert Speer for Berlin. What each of these leaders is and was trying to do is draw on a grandiose, often heavily fictionalized past, an imagined community, in Benedict Anderson's phrasing, to help construct and sustain a glorious future. It is one way in which many authoritarian leaders attempt to persuade populations and produce consent about their regimes materially through the construction of monumental architecture that harkens back to so-called great times. This is not a new story. Indeed, we can trace these kinds of efforts throughout history, and many architectural historians have done just this. The creation of architecture as expressions of state power accompanies the physical use of space, often in or near the same places, public squares or streets or fields that were created through the construction of the monumental architecture. The use and demarcation of these spaces as sites of power are created through movement. Spatial practices such as rallies, parades, and military drills that are repeated, ritualized, and formalized over time are made part of common memory and common sense, relying on perceptions of order, control, and power. As moving spectacle, they become part of the lexicon of national greatness, of who we are, and importantly, how we always were. Spectacle, as Guy Debord observed many years ago, is not merely images and stagecraft, but a social relationship, one that creates passive observers and passive acceptance of the status quo, but also often a sense of community and belonging, key features of the rise and maintenance of authoritarianism. This type of monumental architecture looks back towards a glorious past, and associated spatial practices of military rallies and parades are important aspects of the materialist story. Are important aspects of the materialist story of authoritarian power and the efforts to constitute collective national memory, but they are not the whole story. Alongside these highly visual public displays, there are material and human infrastructures and practices that are decidedly not for public consumption. Yet these generally invisibilized infrastructures and practices, such as forced labor camps or prisons, often coexist and are proximate to the monuments and myths of the national community. And they make them possible. They make possible the construction and continuation of the visions and practices of authoritarian power. In my talk this evening, I will document and examine the coexistence of planned or existing monumental architecture harkening back to a glorious past, spatial practices that attempt to consolidate past, present, and future, and infrastructures of spatial containment and control, of forced labor, mostly a hierarchically racialized, non-local workforce. I locate these coexisting buildings, spaces, and infrastructures and trace them backwards and forwards through time on the same site for nearly a millennia. What I want to accomplish by doing this is to show the ways that collective memories of the past are often deliberately connected to specific spaces and spatial practices, buildings, symbols, and myths that build on and reinforce specific ideologies over time. The site I am looking at is Tempelhof Field in Berlin. While Tempelhof is possibly best known for the Berlin airlift from the late 1940s, a symbol of freedom that the municipality has sought to highlight, the main folds of history or conjunctural moments on this site are authoritarian. These are the moments of Nazism, of Prussian military expansionism, and even of a crusading military order, the Knights Templar of the 13th century. Secondly, I will bring this spatial history forward to the present, to ask, what are the connections of this past to Tempelhof Field today? Now a beloved park in Berlin, but also a highly contested space, with asylum seekers living in substandard conditions in the old airport hangars and on the field, and concurrent development plans for parts of the park that are bitterly rejected by a majority of city residents who voted overwhelmingly in a referendum in 2014 to reject further development of the park. In the current conjuncture, can spatial histories of authoritarian haunting grounds illuminate the present? Okay, before moving on, I just want to have a little disclaimer that I'm at a fairly early stage of this project with much more research to do, and I welcome suggestions. And also, I'm a migration scholar, as Ayşe pointed out, and an urban geographer rather than a historian. And much of the history I present here in this spatial history draws on the archival work of others, which I will cite in my written work. Finally, while I have already gathered hundreds of images, most of them are not yet copyright cleared. So for this recorded talk, many of my illustrations are taken from the Creative Commons. Okay, so let's start my spatial history. I'm going to begin by going way back in time. The broader context for this piece of land stretches back 9 centuries to its role as headquarters for the Knights Templar, for which it is named. The following information is from a wide range of secondary sources that I'm distilling here for the purposes of the talk. A key primary historical record are the Chronicles of the Templar of Tyre from 1263. In discussing the Knights Templar, I want to make 3 points. The first is financial and imperial. The second involves the use of forced or slave labor. And the third relates to contemporary myth-making. First, known primarily as a crusading military order with fortifications worldwide, the Knights Templar was also a highly networked and advanced financial organization with a large economic infrastructure throughout Christendom. They were international in conception and in their banking practices, taking over from the monasteries as secure depositories of money. During the Crusades and pilgrimages era, they offered a system of credit notes where money deposited in one Templar preceptory could be withdrawn at another upon production of the note. Evidence indicates that their record keeping was excellent, and they kept both a daily register and a larger register that formed a permanent archive. They issued statements once or twice a year and could make funds internationally available. Further, they charged interests on loans, but they called these expenses or fines to evade canon law against usury. Now, probably everyone in the audience who has read Braudel will recognize here the development of early forms of capitalism. The Templars were an integral part of the European financial system, and in reward for their loans to kings, they often had full jurisdiction over their estates and its inhabitants. When they came to greatest power in the 13th and early 14th centuries, the Templars provided the financial system, literate financial administrators, and funding that helped enable the development of new nationalism and new forms of imperialism. Use of slaves. The Templars were international financiers and traders, and among the items they traded were slaves. The often highly skilled slaves were primarily from Turkish, Greek, Russian, and Saracen regions, generally brought into slavery by Turkish and Mongol slavers, with the center of the slave trade in Ayşe, which is part of the Armenian Empire, now in modern Turkey. And according to the records, they were put to work in agriculture and in helping to construct and manage the Templar houses or preceptories, which extended in a tight network all through Western Europe and the United Kingdom. They were integral to the production and social reproduction of the Templar economy, enabling it to function as an international imperial system. In terms of spatial practices, the knights themselves are believed to have been disciplined soldiers, engaging in multiple repeated drills and military formations on fields and plains to hone their battle skills. And I should say that there's no historical evidence linking these practices to Tempelhof Field specifically, but this is part of the more general knowledge about this military group during this time. Let's move on to myth-making. Of course, the other important medieval knights and crusaders were the Hospitallers and the Teutonic Knights, the latter being far more active in what has become modern Germany for many more years than the Templars. More than a financial empire, the Teutonic Order derived their power primarily from conquering and ruling land, imposing taxes, controlling trade routes, and running the agricultural estates. But these kinds of historical facts aren't what's important when we're looking at myth-making and memory in space across time. And indeed, these medieval groups have become mixed up and largely indistinguishable for most people in the contemporary era. Medieval knights in general have become an increasingly important symbol in the 21st century for many Europeans and Americans, a symbol of chivalry, masculinity, agency, and righteous defense against invading barbarians. This slide shows contemporary role-playing and toys using Knights Templar and Teutonic Knights symbolism. The red cross on a white background being key imagery, and of course a black cross on a white background for the Teutonic Knights, which was what was adapted by the Prussian military. This kind of mostly benign use of the history associated with these medieval crusaders is extremely common now. But there's also a growing movement that explicitly racializes these symbols and brings them into the present as a rallying ground for white supremacy and opposition to immigration. In a recent paper titled Conspiratorial Medievalism, History and Hyperagency and the Far-Right Knights Templar Security Imaginary, Miller and Lopez investigate how modern extremist groups weaponize these forms of medieval history, symbols, and myths to justify real-world radicalization and political violence. Drawing on documents like the manifestos of far-right mass shooters, such as at Oslo and at Christchurch, who explicitly invoke the Knights Templar to validate their actions. They argue that, quote, the Knights Templar imaginary blends a specific, racialized, and romanticized vision of history with the grammar of conspiracy theory. This is characterized by a belief in the racialized decline and victimization of a righteous white Christendom, B, a sense of threat posed by racialized others and betrayal by insiders, and C, an anachronistic view of near omnipotent individual agency. One of the rallying slogans of this group is Deus vult, or God wills it. You might be interested to know that this is the slogan that United States Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has tattooed on his inner bicep. In his famous work, Les Lieux de Mémoire, Pierre Nora analyzed the memory of the French nation through an examination of the critical myths, symbols, and stereotypes that give access to national consciousness. National memory is a different scale than we're considering at Tempelhof, but national memory is also created out of multiple local instances of material infrastructures, slogans, and repetitions. According to Nora, to construct a sustainable national place of collective memory, 3 criteria have to be met. It must be material, involving tangible objects or spaces, battlefields, architecture. It must have symbolism, involving abstract concepts, such as a slogan, a motto, Deus vult, or a stereotype. And it must have functionality, such as concrete commemorative purposes like rituals, pilgrimages, parades, anniversaries, birthdays. All of these features can be seen being anchored in situ at Tempelhof in specific conjunctural moments of crisis moving forward through time. So let's move to our next moment of rupture, the late Prussian period. While my focus is the period leading just up to World War I will start going back a little earlier. As far as we can tell from the archaeological and archival records, following the demise of the Knights Templar, Tempelhof Field was used primarily for farming purposes before being taken over as a training ground for the Prussian military in 1722. In order to understand what follows over the next century and a half, we need to know something about the social formation or human infrastructure of this military group. And the following information is actually about Berlin more generally, and it's not specific to Tempelhof. It's widely known from the historical record that soldiers from 1733 to 1813 were drawn from a canton system of recruitment districts. Nobles obtained exemption from military service, but frequently served as officers. Whereas recruited soldiers were almost universally rural, peasant, poor, and Catholic. When not at war, conscripted soldiers functioned as what we might now call a reserve army. They were soldiers part-time, but often also worked in the fields or civilian life for minimal remuneration because they were essentially foreigners, dislocated from their villages and often their families and without many options. For this reason, I will put them in the category of semi-coerced forms of labor because of the lack of options. Notably, in addition to exemptions for nobles and the wealthy until 1813, there are also military exemptions for almost all urban residents. The residents of 40 cities, including Berlin and Potsdam, by the king's decree, were exempt from military conscription. Now, most histories indicate an important shift to a supposedly universal conscription with military reforms from above, such as the Landwehr, in 1813. But recent research by Satomi Takaoka, drawing on local municipal newspapers in Berlin of the time, has indicated that the men who were recruited into the military system, in Berlin at least, remained primarily the same group, even after 1815. That is, poor, rural Catholic. Because most city residents were able to purchase their way out of the military through buying the military service of others who could go in their place. In addition to pointing out these ongoing hierarchies within the military, I want to point to the significant and growing use of Polish agricultural laborers who had little choice but to work on the large landed estates of the Junker elite around Berlin in the 19th century. This group of semi-coerced workers aided in the social reproduction of the society, supplying the food and other services necessary to keep the increasingly imperialist Prussian military machine operational. They were collectively housed in dilapidated and unsanitary temporary barracks and shacks, which embedded a narrative of this class of workers as lacking hygiene, discipline, and humanity. This type of treatment and rhetoric were important predecessors to the periods of Bismarck, Wilhelm II, and the Nazis, when Polish and indeed all Eastern workers were perceived as barbaric and uncivilized. Literally, geographically, the further east and more Slavic, the more barbaric and less human. Max Weber himself called this migration a, quote, invasion of Eastern nomadic swarms. The supposed chaos and filth of the Polish agricultural laborers was contrasted with the military, with their precise and disciplined drills on the field and their clean housing. The Spartan, often temporary, yet exceedingly hygienic military barracks of the Prussian soldiers, and they were kept exceptionally clean to avoid disease. Conscripted soldiers were, of course, seen as inferior to the officer classes who were housed in far more solid and spacious accommodations. These kinds of relational hierarchies, plus the coercion and extraction of labor on a spectrum from free to forced, were established and anchored materially through architecture, housing, prisons, and workspaces, but also through spatial practices, such as disciplined drills, parades, and other repeated spectacles, all playing out in specific spaces and locations at Tempelhof and its surrounding areas. Coerced labor practices became more aggressive, violent, and explicitly racialized in the decades just prior to World War I. Indeed, while I don't have time to trace this history here, there's a fair amount of recent scholarship documenting the relationship between the work conditions in the German colonies in Southwest Africa, where the native populations were literally worked to death in prototypical concentration camps, and labor practices at sites such as Tempelhof, where conditions ranged from free labor to semi-coerced to indentured to slavery to POW labor during the war to fully forced in ways that were deeply racially hierarchical. And if anyone's interested in this material history, I really recommend Kenny Kuiper's book, The Earth That Modernism Built, just out in 2024. Two more quick points before I move on to the Nazi period. While the barracks and other buildings at Tempelhof during this era were not monumental architecture per se, the housing for the elite officers was substantial and often luxurious, and the barracks buildings themselves were large and imposing, as you can see from this photo. Of the many buildings from this period that were repurposed by the Nazis a few decades later, I want to highlight here the Columbia House, a building constructed in 1896 that was used as a military prison to discipline conscripted soldiers during the late Prussian period, closed in the late 1920s, then reopened by the Nazis in 1933, after which time it functioned under the control of the Gestapo as a prison, torture center, and concentration camp. It is estimated that at least 8,000 men were imprisoned here before it was dismantled in 1936, then torn down in 1938 to make way for the new airport. Columbia House demonstrates what I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the ways that invisibilize human infrastructures of discipline and control, the human infrastructure that shores up the visions and ambitions of authoritarian and imperial regimes, both in architecture and spatial practices, are usually co-located or proximate to them. These are the spaces of forced labor, of workshops and factories, prisons and temporary worker and conscripted soldiers' housing that don't just coexist horizontally on a plane, on a geographical plane, but which also coexist temporally or vertically, if you will, in the folds of history on a single site. This type of historical repurposing through time has been explored in several sites now around the world, including the city of Linz, Austria, by IWM permanent fellow Professor Çağlar, who argues that the repurposing of historical and industrial spaces such as these should be analyzed through the lens of expanded labor extractivism. These sites, she points out, are frequently marked by coercion, discipline, and the containment of marginalized populations, including up to the contemporary period, involving refugees and asylum seekers. And they are continuously reassembled through state and capitalist agendas that manage labor and its mobility or immobility. Finally, before moving on, I want to underscore the multiple ways that the history, myths, and memories of the Teutonic Knights were employed ideologically by Prussian military leaders, especially leading up to and during World War I. While the rhetoric of pagan conquest and military valor associated with the Knights was part of Prussian collective memory for hundreds of years, it was towards the end of the 19th and the early 20th centuries that nationalist historians such as Heinrich von Treitschke in his 1862 essay Das Deutsche Ordensland Preußen explicitly used the Teutonic Knights to promote pro-German and anti-Slavic rhetoric, framing the Knights as the original architects of German civilization in the East and providing the rationale for Prussian authoritarianism, Polish assimilation, and imperial expansion. I'm going to continue with the same theme. Boy, it's a bit warm in here, isn't it? Can we get the air conditioning maybe going? I can see people in the audience melting in your seats. Thank you. I'm going to continue with this same theme moving into the Nazi period, where the history, myth-making, and symbolism of the Knights is similarly employed by many Nazi leaders, including Alfred Rosenberg, but most famously perhaps by Himmler in multiple speeches to the SS, where he outlined his vision for the elite corps as functioning like the Teutonic Knights. I think most people know this history, so I won't belabor it, but I'll just note how the doctrine of Lebensraum, rationalizing the colonization of the East, was frequently compared to the medieval German eastward expansion, Ostsiedlung. In both the Prussian and the Nazi periods, the campaigns for territorial expansion are narrativized as part of this much longer historical struggle, going back to the Teutonic Knights, fighting against and conquering the reputedly uncivilized and inferior Slavic and Asiatic peoples. And as a side note of interest, Hitler and Himmler drew on a heavily romanticized and often fictionalized history and imagery of the Knights, but at the same time, Hitler banned the surviving religious order as its military background was seen as a threat to his regime. The Nazi rallies at Tempelhof Field in the 1930s are infamous, especially the one held on May 1st, 1933, Workers' Day, where over 1 million people stretched out over the entire field. It was not accidental that this event was held in Berlin and at Tempelhof Field. In the mid-1920s, Goebbels had been given the responsibility to increase support for the Nazi Party in what he described then as the, quote, reddest city in Europe besides Moscow, end quote. A week after he took charge, he organized a march through Neukölln district near Tempelhof, which was a communist stronghold, and it led to a street riot. This was followed by similar provocations and riots in which the notorious Nazi brown shirts were employed to beat up hundreds of communists and other opponents while simultaneously directing the rage of the unemployed against the wealthy and then against the Jews. In a sense, Berlin was the proving ground for these intersecting, often contradictory ideologies and tactics of both violence and persuasion, coercion and consent, that were articulated into a hegemonic bloc and which became successful throughout the country over the following decade. The monumental rally on Workers' Day on May 1st and successive rallies at Tempelhof Field commemorated and ritualized these victories spatially, creating a repeated spectacle with associated symbols and slogans that were designed to become part of national consciousness and collective memory. Further, although you probably can't see it, the photograph on the left shows the positioning of Hitler's podium next to the famed poplar tree, which was directly associated with the military practices of the Prussian era. This kind of proximate positioning is a typical way in which authoritarian regimes draw on the symbols of power of prior periods of military prowess and territorial expansion to solidify and legitimize their own. Additionally, as I discussed in the introduction, Hitler was interested in developing a grand plan for Berlin, Germania. It was envisioned as the global capital of a 1,000-year Reich. The images here show two of the more monumental architectural features of the plan, including the Great Hall of the People, modeled on the Pantheon, which would have been the largest covered space in the world, and a triumphal arch. A 7-kilometer north-south boulevard linking them would have also had monumental buildings lining it on the sides, with the avenue itself serving as a site for massive parades. In the image on the right, you can see the terminal of Tempelhof Airport, the complex of which was to be the southern anchor of the axis. It's up there in the far right corner, far left corner. Speer was attempting to link and showcase neoclassical solidity and Roman reference with modern transportation technology, including the massive planned airport, which was partially constructed in the mid to late 1930s with a terminal designed by Ernst Seigeville, but also a new railway station and a massive underground road system. Everything was massive, and everything, the buildings, the plan, the transportation system, and the architecture itself, were all intended to reflect the glories of the past, articulated with the technological advances of the present, and leading towards a limitless future of power and control. Much, of course, has been written about Germania, although until relatively recently, less has been written about the expulsions and destruction of the existing city that the vision would have brought about, as well as the massive amount of forced labor that would have been needed to build it. An important exception is the permanent exhibit on Germania at the Berlin Unterwelten Museum, which explicitly discusses the role of forced labor in building out monumental plans like this. Despite this type of education, however, even now, if you go to a Reddit discussion about Germania, as I have done, and I encourage you to do, you will find many people extolling the work of Albert Speer and the impressiveness of these plans for Berlin. While Germania was never realized, the amount of forced labor employed in Berlin at Tempelhof Field during the 1930s and 40s was staggering. There were over 3,000 forced labor camps in Berlin, and over 8,000 of them were housed at 8,000 of them were housed at Tempelhof by 1936. Many of the larger industrial companies of the era drew on this labor, I should have said 800 of them were housed at Tempelhof, sorry. Many of the larger industrial companies of the era drew on this labor well before the war. 50% of Lufthansa's fleet of Junkers Ju-52 were built at Berlin Tempelhof as early as 1932. After the war started in 1939, companies such as Weserflug and Lufthansa moved their armament production unit to the building. Between 1940 and 1944, there were 2,000 who worked for Weserflug alone, with differential and coexisting forms of labor on a spectrum of free civilian workers to various kinds of forced labor, including French and Russian POWs, deportees from Poland, Ukraine, and the Netherlands, and conscripted Jews before they were sent to a concentration camp. Historians Matthias Heissig and Lutz Badras have written specifically about this. thinking about labor extractivism on a continuum of exploitation, as I am pointing to here at Tempelhof across different areas, helps us to see the similarities or generalities of capitalist exploitation alongside the particularities or differences of each case. At the less extreme end, workers experience wage theft from insufficient wages, poor and/or dangerous working conditions, and overwork through mandatory forms of overtime. In these situations, they have some levels of choice, but they are trapped by economic precarity in terms of those choices. At the other extreme end of the spectrum is direct physical violence, forms of indenture and debt bondage, human trafficking, and the loss of all forms of consent. At this more extreme end, workers are often confined and immobilized. This can be in military barracks, factories, and prisons, as we see here, but also in constrained spaces such as deportation centers and temporary housing for asylum seekers and refugees. Many labor scholars are now framing labor coercion in this way, not as a binary relationship of free versus unfree, as in most classical Marxian theory, but as an entangled spectrum ranging from acceptable work to various forms of slavery. I am interested in these forms of theorization as they help me to think about the deep histories of this space all the way up to the present moment, where we can conceptualize the governance of displaced populations today as a form of expanded extractivism. Forced laborers lived in wooden or brick barracks, and archaeological and historical evidence suggests the housing was thinly walled and inadequate for Berlin's winters, with external lights used in surveillance and few personal effects among the residents. Work and living conditions overall were abysmal, but it's important to know that they were organized hierarchically, with the national origins, gender, and ethnicity of workers determining the type of accommodation, type of labor, level of surveillance, degree of freedom of movement, and the size of food rations, with Jews, women who often had to work with toxic chemicals, as in the photo here on the right. Oops. As in the photo there on the right. And those coming from the Far East experiencing the worst conditions. People's status in this regard was sewn directly into their clothing, with patches for Polish, Soviet, and Jewish workers indicating their identities and what the corresponding treatment should be. And there's a patch here that shows this person was from Poland. The surveillance, disciplining, and terrorizing of the confined workers was extreme, and those arrested for things such as the suspicion of sabotage, theft, refusal to work, resistance, forming a gang, or forbidden contact with Germans were subject to a verdict by special courts and often punished with death. The cases of Eastern Europeans and Poles, however, were handled by the Gestapo under the heading of special treatment, and these workers were executed without trial. Many companies using these laborers were complicitous in the system of confinement and control, imposing their own penalties and reporting suspicious behavior to police, sending the workers into the hands of the police, the Gestapo, and the judiciary. And an interesting side note is I found in my reading that Lufthansa had commissioned an official history of their company relatively recently. And one of the historians who was asked to work on this was Lutz Badras, who wrote a detailed section on the use of forced labor, but they wouldn't publish it. It was too much for the official history. And so when I got the book from the library, it had his section in a in a pamphlet form stuck into a plastic folder at the back of the book. So they couldn't quite get rid of it, but they also didn't want it in the book. So it was part of this, it was in this sort of tangential space. However, he has published separately as Adler and Kanisch, The Eagle and the Crane, a book in 2016, which details the conditions of forced labor in Lufthansa. I would now like to move us to the present moment on this same site, where some of the hangars of the old airport have been repurposed for refugee processing and accommodation, and new temporary containers called tempo homes have been built on a part of the field. The Tempo homes are modular containers called, that were built on site in 2017 for 1,000 people and were intended to be closed by 2019, following the rules of the Tempelhof law prohibiting permanent construction on the airfield. This was following a major influx of asylum seekers in 2015-16 after the Arab Spring and ensuing crackdowns and war. Drawing on Walter Benjamin's famous aphorism, over a decade since the first arrivals, however, it has become clear that the state of emergency, in which this state of permanent temporariness exists, is not the exception, but the rule. Not only are the hangars still occupied, but newer arrivals from Ukraine in 2022 and elsewhere are now housed in additional temporary accommodations at Tempelhof Field. Meanwhile, the Berlin Senate has continued to authorize temporary extensions for these shelters for humanitarian reasons, and in 2025, the Senate approved plans to expand container villages such as these across the city. As many in the audience, I'm sure, are aware, Berlin is facing a severe shortage of housing, affordable housing for the population at large, and not just for refugees. This follows earlier moments of fame and notoriety for the airport, including the Berlin airlift of 48-49, labeled and highlighted as a period of freedom, the closure of the civilian airport in 2008, the formation of a public park in 2010 after significant public pressure to do so, and the referendum of 2014 that would forbid any permanent construction on the park. For many refugees, asylum seekers, and rejected asylum seekers still living at Tempelhof Field now, the material conditions of life are very difficult. The accommodations are small and lack privacy, and in the airport hangars, it is forbidden to personalize the space, so they feel cold and Spartan. Ironically, because Tempelhof Airport is now a protected historical landmark, strict preservation guidelines dictate how the space can be used. Alterations are not allowed, leaving, as Toby Parslow writes, quote, the entire camp to exist in a permanently ephemeral state, end quote. Nothing can be affixed to the hangar walls, which are pristine and white. Even colorful graffiti, such as children's drawings, murals, names and maps of hometowns, and religious symbols were removed and banned in 2016 for fear of interior conflict and bad press. The roughly 1,300 people who still live in the emergency shelter and temporary containers are on a mix of permits, with most recent arrivals on temporary stay permits, while some are Duldung permit holders. The Duldung permit is translated generally as tolerated stay or toleration. It is not a residence permit or a work permit. Indeed, most immigrants who receive these permits are rejected asylum seekers, specifically not allowed to stay in the country. However, Duldung holders cannot be deported for legal reasons, and thus they are tolerated to remain in Germany until something changes and the obstacles to deportation are resolved. The residence and work requirements for those on this type of permit are strict and were made more draconian in 2022. Duldung permit holders have grown rapidly in Germany over the last decade. In 2013, there were 94,000 permits of this type. By late 2022, the figure had increased to 248,000. As Corvin Sierra has recently documented in her dissertation, a large proportion of these types of permits are given to West Africans, indicating a strong racial component to the practice. Those on Duldung permits live in a state of spatio-temporal suspension, neither legal nor deportable. And many Duldung permits are strung together through continuous short-term renewals. Hence, people can live for years with the status of illegalized residents with restrictions on both where and what types of work can be taken, if any, and where and what types of accommodation can be legally accessed, if any. Immigrants in these types of situations live in suspended states. They are rendered largely immobile, trapped in parts of the city, trapped in low-paying jobs, if they can find them, and trapped emotionally and psychologically in the sense of the impossibility of seeing a better future. Meanwhile, the imagery and symbols of medieval Catholic military orders have emerged once again, including by Dietmar Friedhof and Dario Seifert, prominent AfD politicians who publicly wore the Jakobkreuz, the Cross of St. James, a symbol used historically by the medieval Knights of Santiago in 2019 to signify the militant defense of European and Christian values. These are just two of many Christian identitarians on the far right who routinely use the Knights Templar and Teutonic Knights myths and symbols to idealize masculine political religious views against perceived modern decay and immigrant invasion. Why did I articulate these different eras and give you a snapshot of authoritarianism over time? How it is at least partially produced through material and human infrastructures and held in collective memory and myth-making in space. I did so because I believe that we are at a precarious moment in history, a transitional moment of rupture where the old is over, but it isn't yet clear what will take its place. It is times of uncertainty like these that are the most perilous. Gramsci famously wrote, "The old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." By this, he was referring to the social upheavals in Italy in the 1920s and 30s, when the chaos and political instability of the moment produced new opportunities for progressive change, but also for the rise of fascism. Writing from prison, his central question, the one that I believe pervades his notebooks, is, why did history go in one direction and not the other? It's to answer that central critical question that he examines struggles over hegemony in multiple places and multiple scales, investigating the different intersecting confluence of forces, economic, political, social, cultural, ideological, during a moment of rupture. This is the essence of conjunctural thinking. In geography, conjunctural analysis is a deeply contextual method used to understand how multiple broad or macro-level structures and processes interact with highly specific local, historical, and cultural conditions. It uses thick theorization and thick description to examine the complex ways that different forces intersect in both time and place. And rather than applying broad or reductionist formulas, it maps overlapping crises to try to find opportunities for political and social intervention. Gramsci wanted to understand how consent is won, not just by force and coercion, but also by ideology and persuasion. A main argument of my talk today is that these efforts to produce hegemony have a spatial component to them. They are efforts that involve infrastructure, both material and human, and the collective, borrowed, and often fabricated memories created and associated with them. At Tempelhof Field, there have been many moments of hegemonic production and hegemonic struggle that we can see condensed in time and place in specific moments of crisis. Hegemonic struggle is always in process. It is never complete. Recent efforts by historians have helped to elucidate the whole history of Tempelhof, and not just Tempelhof freedom, over the last 2 decades. But at the same time, we can see ideological moves by others, such as the AfD and political parties and governments like them worldwide, to not remember or to misremember these spatial histories. Contemporary theoretical work in many fields is now drawing on the legacy of Gramsci, as well as more recent thinkers such as Stuart Hall, Doreen Massey, Jill Hart, and Jamie Peck, who are using a conjunctural frame. This body of work is dedicated to understanding the present through looking at the conjunctures of the past. A research method that contextualizes or widens the frame, a Stuart Hall quote, of the local and the particular by opening up new historical and spatial horizons that bring key, broader forces into play. Although my talk today began nearly a millennia ago, what I really want to understand is the present, so that I and others can intervene in the present in useful ways. The geographer Jill Hart has written recently that in order to understand our present conjuncture, we need to go further back in time than most conjunctural theorists have explored to date. She argues that investigating back as far as the age of revolution, the late 18th and early 19th centuries, is necessary to understand the present because of the beginnings of racial science during the period, alongside the rise of industrial capitalism and colonialism. The development of these earlier structuring processes, especially the ideas around eugenics and race that were being developed at the time and tried out in the colonies, impacted the ways that labor was extracted differentially. Perceived racial and ethnic differences were institutionalized through various forms of spatial discipline, labor practices, housing, and governance played out over time and in material spaces in order to stick and become part of common sense, to become part of a hegemonic settlement. I chose to go further back in time to the history and myths of a medieval military orders, because I believe this often fabricated history and its spatial symbols and ideals have also become part of hegemonic struggles today. There is now a growing literature in geography and related disciplines on the ways that architecture, repeated spatial practices, and spaces of containment can become embedded in collective memory and institutional structures. But even though it is a recurring pattern, there is not much research exploring how racialized confinement over time recurs in specific sites and impacts contemporary policies, especially related to current pressing questions of immigrant asylum, detention, and housing, as well as decisions about labor. For example, who can work, when and where? Who must work, when and where, in order to remain in the country? Many of these types of decisions and policies about work in Germany today are bitterly contested, with some mainstream parties supporting mandatory community work schemes, while others, especially far-right parties, oppose access to the labor market. How refugee asylum seekers and rejected asylum seekers, including those on Duldung permits, are seen by these political parties and decision makers can be greatly impacted by prior rounds of spatially anchored and repeated forms of racialization. There was an important referendum about Tempelhof Field in 2014, where a significant majority in the city voted not to develop the park. But now there are renewed efforts to develop the park, including right now. In 2016, and again in 2022, there were strong efforts to welcome refugees and asylum seekers to Berlin and to Germany and to Europe, at Tempelhof and elsewhere. Now we are seeing efforts to demonize foreigners and asylum seekers, particularly those of color, by many, and not just conservative parties. At Tempelhof, these may be small crises on a small space, but they reflect the broader crises in many parts of the world. Struggles like these are about the type of society and world we want. They're struggles over politics. What type of democracy do we envision? They are struggles over parks and public space. What type of environment, what type of planet can we see and protect? They are struggles over the fate of asylum seekers, refugees, and immigrants. What type of welcome do we give to outsiders? What type of society do we want? These are all struggles over hegemony. Why does society go one way and not another in a moment of crisis? And how do we nudge it in the direction we want it to go? The past can help us, but we need to remember all of it. Tempelhof Field has been a space of freedom. It has also been a haunting grounds for authoritarianism. If we want an open society, a democratic politics, and a healthy planet, a future different than the direction many parts of the world are now heading, we must know our spatial histories. We must know and reject the authoritarian impulses of the past, and we must imbue our buildings, our places, and our practices with new memories, those that embody the values and visions of the society we want to become. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Katharyne. That is very powerful and very powerful tool, and also very interesting for food for thought. And for me, it is much more, particularly exciting because it intersects with what I have been doing, and then we have been doing this separately, that without knowing from each other, we knew each other's work, but we didn't know that we were doing in a similar way. There are several issues that I would like to start with, and I mean, this is the advantage of being a moderator, so that I could start with my questions. I mean, nowadays space looms large in the horizon of disciplines, and very different disciplines use space in a very different way. And the way that you're bringing the spatial history, it is not simply space. That the way that you, as I see it, that the spatial history, but spatial history with the materiality, that how that space is made, that you were talking about the infrastructures, that the material and then the human infrastructures. But again, it is not simply a spatial history, because you could not understand the spatial history, not only without the materiality, but also the conjunctural, so that in a way that it's a complicated architecture. And what I want to ask is that the question about the conjuncture that you were asking, we cannot, and going back to Gillian Hart, we cannot have the conjunctural without the history. And yes, and there are the, I mean, how far you go, but also the other side is that could we really understand the conjunctural without the comparative? That this is because what you are describing here is that it's not unique. This is the kind of the interesting part, that, I mean, what I'm seeing in Linz, what I'm seeing in Essen, what you see in Laros, what you see in Italy, that we had a conference here in December about those sites of containment and then the repurposing. So is it possible to understand the conjuncture without that kind of, does it require not only going back across time, but also across space? That is my first question.
I think that's the essence of conjunctural analysis, is to make the comparisons back in time and also look outward at different scales, at different spaces. And that's exactly what Gramsci was doing, obviously, which is, who is often considered to be the, in terms of the genealogy of conjunctural thought, the main man. And he really, in order to understand the history, the present of Italy, he felt it was necessary to go as far back as the Risorgimento, right? To see how the political parties were being formed and to understand how the ideology and culture and leadership and values of the leaders of society mattered. And it wasn't just a matter of, oh, there's an economic crisis, we're heading to fascism. So to move away from a sort of economically determinist or a historical materialism that is really seeing the economic as all important and seeing history as a kind of a preordained path. In order to avoid that, what he wants to do is to take these different moments, historical moments, and see what's going on at each of those historical moments. So he's comparing, the present time parties and processes with moments going back in time to try to see where did it come from. And how can we sort of trace those moments forward to the present? And the reason he does that is because he believes history is a philosophy of praxis. He doesn't just think of history as a storytelling. He thinks history is something alive. It's the ability to understand the psychological and economic mechanisms of power that are operational, and through that intervene. So if you're looking at history as a way of thinking about how are we going to be able to intervene in the present and nudge history in the direction, nudge society in the direction we want to go. So history doesn't go in the direction we're like, why did it go that direction and not the other? We nudge it in the direction we go, but you can't do that if you don't have an analysis of these kinds of parties and practices through time.
Yeah,
and across space.
Yeah, that is, I think, that is the true time across time. It is, I mean, it's very obvious, but the kind of for the conjunctural thinking, I'm thinking that seems to be the across space is crucial. Too, because you see that this is the striking thing. Similar kind of histories, of kind of unfolding histories, but not in a linear way. That is not in a kind of a linearity in it. This is what the conjunctural brings in it. And I have another question in terms of invisibilization of the infrastructures, material and human infrastructures, because we could see in so many places these, but what you were hinting at was that it went together with the monumental, with something else was there too. So it is not simply coarse labor or the materiality of those places, but these spaces in the broader sense entailed something else. And that also seems to widen the spatial history. So it is not only going down, that's how wide that we should go. And that I would like to ask you in terms of, from not in terms of Tempelhof, but in general, do you see this kind of the connection in those kind of spaces? There's infrastructure, material and human infrastructures, coarse labor, that is, and it's different, 50 shades of confined labor, you find it. Like this X number of those permits, that the categorizations and everything. It is in a way invisibilized, but then this kind of infrastructure seems to go together with something else in that space.
Well, one of the reasons I'm interested in thinking about labor extraction on a spectrum or continuum rather than a binary is because I think it enables you to get at exactly those kinds of questions of the complexity of labor practices, and that enables you to look at something like the ways that asylum seekers, refugees, rejected asylum seekers, immigrants are positioned in a system where their labor is producing value, and they are being paid often, but not under conditions of their own choosing, so to speak. So they're in ways they're coerced in the sense of how they are positioned spatially and in time, in their statuses. And if you just have the binary, you can't really locate those forms of governance and practices of control from the government or from industry or capitalist companies if you're saying they're either paid or they're slaves. So it's trying to find these kinds of, and all the way through history I was trying to show there's often this complexity that I think is important to really draw out because it allows you to see the generalities that are about coercion, but also the specificities. There are various forms of coercion. And there's various kinds of ways that state's involved, and there's various kinds of ways that companies or capital is involved. And I should ask you because you've done more on this.
But no, I just want to underline in terms of this kind of the continuum becomes kind of a mechanism of governance.
Yes.
It becomes really, because if you look at it, it is not pure coarse. Of course, there is pure coarse labor too, but it exists with so many others, so many variations that then you can never capture with those kind of the binaries. But I think the people have some other questions that
I just wanted to point out that the feminists back in the 1960s were really the first theorists to point out that the classical Marxian categories of free wage labor versus coerced really didn't work for women in the household, who were obviously integral in terms of their social reproduction to the upholding of the productive system. But their labor was in the domestic sphere was unpaid, and so they didn't really fit into sort of more classical Marxian analysis. And so they were the first, Marxist feminists were the first ones to sort of look at the identity of and the forms of labor and the ways that coercion operate differently on different kinds of bodies. And you really, to understand how different kinds of bodies are integral to a capitalist system, you need to sort of open up that binary.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think we should, we carry this materiality of the power and regimes, actually, and the spatiality, but let's open for the questions that, yes, there's someone there.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your lecture. It was very insightful. And as we can see that history is repeating, and that this form of control during the different times and eras are similar. We have the same in North Macedonia, for example. The first thing that our autocrat built was the arch. And I would like to ask about the answer from the side of liberal democracy, because we can see in the history these oppressors like strategies. But to build a new strategy, and this, as Gramsci says, to build this new thing, maybe we should look as well in the history as well, on the side of the liberal democracy, on the side of the I don't know, fighting for these values against the oppressors, and this kind of battle, this kind of fight for values, we can search in history as well, many different answers. So in this kind of many different answers, we can also have an ideas how this new can arise as some kind of strategy, because now we're living in a real time of monsters in these stakeholders, and we really need some solution, some strategy for the future. But thank you very much for the insight in the history as well.
Well, I actually love to respond to that, because that is a great question, and I want to say that this talk, I know, is a little depressing in many ways, but that my prior work, I looked at the importance of spatial memory held in churches that were protecting asylum seekers from state practices of deportation. So, and how there was a transnational networking between a church, particularly in Berlin, and the sanctuary movement in the 1980s in the US, in the Southwest, which protected people fleeing from Guatemala and El Salvador during the era when Ronald Reagan was calling anybody fleeing from those countries not refugees, because it was not politically expedient for his government. So they were being expelled back to torture in their homes. And a group of ministers and other faith-based leaders in the US got together, and in very famous cases, because they got publicized, protected these asylum seekers and made that a public protection, and it became so well known that when they wanted to do the same thing in Germany, they brought some of the leaders from that movement to Germany, to Berlin, and they've had these a series of conferences over the last several years. So my last work is looking, if you will, at the sort of like how you can also use alternative sense of justice and transnational networking and activism to protect people, drawing on the memories of the past. And the one last piece is that the 1980s people in the US were saying that their tradition of protecting this, welcome the stranger, protecting with sanctuary, goes back to the Bible and Matthew. And so, this through historical texts of memory, they were believing that they were continuing a tradition against the national sovereignty of the government, who said, no, we have the right to control immigration and international law. And they're like, no, our law is higher than yours, and it goes back thousands of years to the Bible. And then, so they used that, and then also to the Underground Railroad in the 1880s in the United States, earlier period in the 1860s and earlier. So there's all these traditions of sanctuary that were drawn on by, going backwards in time by the Berlin group that I was looking at. So I led with this sort of like depressing story of the negative use of symbols from the past, or if you will, the ways that these moments can be drawn on for authoritarian and imperialist purposes. But there's also alternative forms of memory and justice.
Thank you.
Clemena?
Katharyne, thank you very much. This was really very interesting. Can I ask you a question about something which wasn't at all central in your talk? You just mentioned it, and I wonder if you're generally interested in this issue in your project. You mentioned this Germania project, which is actually something that wasn't realized. So the link between spatiality and materiality is not there. It's a spatial imagining or something like that. And this reminded me in more or less the same period, in Soviet Russia, you had this project of the Palace of the Soviets that I've always found very fascinating, because it was again a project that was never put into practice. There was no Palace of the Soviets. And at the same time, people were writing and talking at the time about the Palace of the Soviets like an actually existing structure. A friend of mine a few years ago went to Moscow, and she told me the first thing she wanted to see was the Palace of the Soviets.
Yeah.
And I told her, but there's never been a palace. So I wonder whether, in a way, the difference between certain authoritarian regimes of the past that you mentioned and nowadays examples of authoritarianism may not lie in this sort of idea of the future. With Nazism, with Soviet communism, you had this idea that something doesn't even need to exist, but because it is part of your belief in the future, it will be put into practice. So the idea was the Palace of the Soviets doesn't exist now. It will surely exist in the future because the future belongs to us. Yeah. While now, if President Trump doesn't build his triumphal arch, I think it will largely be seen as a failure, partly because I don't think that in many of the authoritarian projects nowadays, there is this sense of the future belongs to us. So I don't know if this is the right interpretation or not, and whether you're at all interested in these spatial projects that are actually not put into practice at all.
It actually be a great book to investigate that kind of thing across societies and time. As you know, you could tell, I'm very interested in memory and the struggles over it. Buildings that aren't built, even if they're talked about, can become part of the collective conscious, right? The sort of national archive of who we are, if it exists in the discussion sphere enough. And so I think, as you pointed out, these kinds of projects take on a life that is just as important as, if you will, in the imagination than if they were actually built. In some cases, maybe more so, because this triumphal arch of Trump's is going to be god-awful. It's going to be so ugly. But in the talking of it, maybe people will think, well, that's just going to be an amazing demonstration of his power and prestige. So maybe in a way, they're better if they're never built. Just like utopia, as soon as you build a utopia, it's done for, right? The few efforts where people try to put the ideas of something like that in space, physical space, it immediately destroys the hopes and the aspirations and the imaginations that people have about and that are associated with these ideas. I'm just riffing off some of the things. I haven't actually thought about that as a project, but I think it's quite interesting.
Okay. Are there any other? Oh, okay. Yes.
I'm so glad I made it. I stumbled down the stairs just in time. Yeah. Can you guys hear me? Or I'll use the mic. Okay. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here. And there's just so many layers in what's going on. It's hard for me to sort it into a few precise points to speak of. So I'll start right at the end with Antonio Sochi, is his name?
Gramsci?
Gramsci, yeah. And that these times are the time of monsters. And in the talk, we're talking about authoritarianism. And I think the missing figure in the room that's just as important in this discussion could be democracy. And in that case, there's a reference at the beginning. It was almost like a gesture, just dropped and then repeated once more, about the banking systems of the Templars and how they represent not democratic structures, but banking structures, monetary structures. And that throws already a triad into a picture. I don't want to describe it all. I want to leave that to you. The thoughts going through my head are just flying. But this triad of tensions and ambitions has to do with something else, to a question, why? Why is there the rise of authoritarianism now? And what does it have to do with perhaps other practices and promises that have been made in a democracy that that's failing may not be the right word, but it's decomposing almost before our eyes may be a way to say it. I don't know. I think I've said enough for you to run with it.
No, because of time, maybe we just collect. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah? Okay, because you had a question.
Okay,
yeah,
thanks.
Okay.
Try to remember.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. My question would be partially related to a point that you made about the technological development of these places, the idea, the imagination that also these spaces include ways to connect the ideology also to technological development. That you mentioned that the airport is such a space, the transportation, but it is also a space related to communication, because in Nazi mass rallies and Goebbels, these spaces were also linked to infrastructure and technology of communication, of amplifying the voice of the authoritarian leader. And at the same time, in your talk, you make this very strong point about the invisibility of forced labor, nowadays refugees. And I think that one of the main tensions and challenges for a researcher and for research is how to give voice to the people who remained invisible. And in this respect, my question would be related to your approach, to your position as a researcher, as a scholar of this very profound, indeed, topic. How to give voice to people who remained invisible throughout this long history of the space? Thank you very much.
Yep.
Both questions,
Yeah.
yeah. Whichever you
Okay,
start.
yeah, it's easier to start with the last one. So it's a great question, and I'll start by saying that I think of scholarship as collaborative, and so I don't feel like I need to do everything. That ethnographies and interviews are really important to understand how people are receiving their situation, how they are experiencing and handling and dealing with their lives. And there are a lot of people doing that work, which is like, as I mentioned, one of the dissertations of people who was looking at the Duldung holders, her whole dissertation is a set of interviews with people who are on these things. So I don't personally feel like I have to do all of that, and but at the same time, I feel like somebody does. You know, that it's a responsibility of us as a collective of scholars. My interest is more as looking at the ways that hegemonic production is produced and disseminated and then and repeated through time in this talk. In other talks I've done interviews and the talk on asylum and sanctuary, I did that type of work. But this type of work is not that. So I guess the answer is yes, it's really important for people to be heard. That's not this project. But it is what many people are doing in their other work. I hope does that make sense? Okay. In terms of understanding how authoritarianism unfolds, I think we need to examine each individual case. So I would never, it's contingent, it's contextual. That's the most important thing to get out of conjunctural theory, is that we can't make blanket statements. And this is the problem with a lot of sort of more vulgar Marxist work, even good historical materialism in other ways. If it has an economically deterministic sort of undercurrent, then you're always going to see capitalist crises, the contradictions of capital, struggles of labor leading to fascism. That's the way you'll always see. And I don't think that's how history unfolds. I think it really matters what the specific local culture and context is, so as to how these projects develop. We are seeing a rise of them around the world, sort of the move to authoritarianism around the world. So I think there are certain generalities we can say that are that have to do with climate change and uneven development and inequitable financial systems, and there are certain generalities, but how those play out has to do with the local politics, culture, history, ideology, and then and struggles by people like us, like not to let our societies go in a direction we don't want them to go. Does that help answer?
Yeah. It's good for you.
Okay. Sounds good.
Are there any other questions? We're running actually out of time, but I mean, one thing I would just, again, abuse my position, come back to what Clemena was asking, that in terms of these not realized projects, and I think this is very important, but somehow in the cases that I had looked at, not realized projects come up and picked up in a very different way in fragments than you see that in a kind of a visceral kind of a presence, that they have the presence of the absent very strongly and continues, and that is a very intriguing and haunting way of, that it continues and continuous space. So I think that the story, I'm not going to say the story, but what Katharyne presented in a way, it would not have been possible without the spatial history that we could not be able to get this, I think, without the spatial history in terms of just narrating that who did what, and without the spatial aspect of it. But thank you very much, Katharyne, for those wonderful, for this wonderful talk, and thank you very much for your questions. And first, big applause to Katharyne, and then join us for the wine and cheese. Thank you, Katharyne.
Thank you.